Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think the section is full of motivational and thought-provoking posts and messages that I will bring back home literally and carry along my journey as a researchers and educators. And thank you once again. And next in our agenda, please welcome Professor Aaron Benavert from University of Armani, State University of New York, for section 2, panel discussion, ASEAN's Transversal Competencies Education, Policy, Research, and Practice. Please, Professor Aaron.
So I'd like to welcome all of you that are joining us today again for this very special conference. Wherever you may be, I happen to be in Seoul, Korea just now, but I know we have people kind of throughout the world joining us, and it's lovely that you could be here during this very special get-together. And I would especially like to thank Professor Kai-Ming Chang for such an enlightening and provocative initial keynote speech. And I'm sure that many of the messages and questions in particular that he raised will resonate throughout the day and help to, will be integrated into many of the other discussions that we will have as we move through the conference. So thank you very much for starting us off, and also from the questions from our two discussants. So I had the great pleasure of bringing together some specialists in the ASEAN region. We are going to have more of a discussion rather than a presentation and response. We have joining us 5 different colleagues who represent different countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and 2 from Singapore who are experts in Cambodia. So I'd like to, the occasion of this session, I think, will enable us to think a little bit more about contextualizing what it means to envision and implement transversal competencies in the actual intended curricula and in the implementation of these curricula in local classrooms and local schools, in particular national contexts. So this helps us to kind of move the conversation a little bit further from the abstract to the concrete in some ways. And so I'm very delighted that we have some real experts in these areas to join us today. So let me begin by introducing the 5 panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Joy Pangilinan, who's the officer in charge of the Education Assessment Division at the Bureau of Education Assessment in the Philippines. She's been intensely involved in the development of a robust assessment framework to accompany the rollout of a major curricular reform in the Philippines, which began more than 6 years ago. Part of her work has been to identify and define 21st century skill priorities in the new curriculum and to integrate these into a coherent assessment framework. And then from Singapore, we have 2 colleagues joining us. First, John Yao, who is a senior member of the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning at the National Institute of Education in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Dr. Yao specializes in creative thinking, curriculum design, teachers' professional learning, and authentic assessment. He's the author and co-editor of several books, including Mastering the Art of Authentic Assessment and Sustainable School Reform Through Lesson Study for Learning Community. And I'm also delighted to introduce Xuxing Li, who's a research scientist in the Center for Research and Pedagogy and Practice at the National Institute of Education, also in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Dr. Li's research interests include the broader social context of education, situating professional learning, teacher inquiry, teacher professionalism, and learning. And an important recent publication that Dr. Lee co-authored is entitled Innovations in Educational Change, Cultivating Ecologies for Schools. And then I would like to present Farladina Yasub, who's an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction Technology in the Faculty of Education at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. Dr. Farah conducts research and publishes in the area of higher education, Web 2.0, social media, educational games, and mobile learning. And she's especially known for her civic-minded instructional design conceptual framework, which has reframed current ways of educating professionals for the purpose of improving public life. She's received numerous awards in recent years for her innovative academic endeavors. And last but certainly not least, our Vietnamese colleague, Nguyen Hong Lian, who's an education researcher for the National Center for Sustainable Development of General Education Quality at VINIUS, the Vietnam Institute of Educational Sciences. She's conducted research of primary and secondary education that's mainly focused on improving teacher competencies, student skills, social studies, the social studies curriculum, gender, and environmental education. And in addition to her extensive publication record, she's collaborated with international organizations such as UNESCO and PLAN on the study of gender and education in Vietnam. So we really have a very prominent and knowledgeable group of panelists, and I invite them to, first of all, speak to a very simple question, as it were. If they could please describe the country's policy, their country, or the country policy that they have the greatest expertise about toward the inclusion of transversal competencies or 21st century skills. And I think at this point, we'll just kind of go around and begin with Joy. Would you like to briefly, before I ask you to speak, let me just also mention to our audience that if you have particular questions that you would like to raise during the course of our session today, please put them in the Q&A, and we hopefully will have time to address one or two of them toward the end of the hour. With apologies, Joy, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
All right, so I'll be sharing the context or the experience of the Philippines when it comes to the inclusion of transversal competencies or 21st century skills. When the Philippines first rolled out its K-12 basic education program, the Philippines desired that the program or the new educational system would be robust, at par with international standards, and responsive. So when we say it's responsive, the graduates of the K-12 program would be able to adapt to the VUCA world, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and at now disruptive. And the program also desires that the graduates would be able to thrive in different exits, such as higher education, employment, entrepreneurship, and middle-level skills development. But looking into the curriculum content and the assessment focus, which has been more on subject matter, subject area mastery, or content subject area mastery, there should be a shift so that the country would be able to achieve what it wants for its K-12 graduates. So from what it has been doing, which is content subject area assessment, the country shifted its focus on assessing transversal competencies or 21st century skills. So, so that was the major shift. And the country desired that the assessment would be robust. Not only, the country will not only utilize internal assessments or national assessments, but it would also include external assessments such as international large-scale assessments, so that the country would be able to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of the new educational system that was implemented since 2012. So part of this of his strong drive for educational quality is participation in international large-scale assessments. And this, the participation in international large-scale assessment does not only focus on curriculum assessment, but also in skills-based assessment, such as what is being done in the program for international student assessment, or PISA. So that is what the country is doing when it comes to the inclusion of transversal competencies in its policies.
Thank you very much for your initial intervention. Let me turn it over to one of our Singaporean colleagues. Perhaps John, you'd begin.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning. And so as we look at the work that we've done previously, while I was still with the NTU, Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, examining how 21st century skills are being designed as part of the national overarching framework, as well as how we develop that into school-based curriculum design. Thereafter, looking at then the dimensions of assessment, as well as incorporating this into a programmatic way of examining how affective skills are learned together with the 21st century competencies. I'll leave the part of Singapore to my colleague Shu Xing to talk a bit more later on. But let me focus on the current research that I'm doing with Cambodia. Clearly, we know that the way forward is armed with a lot of challenges, especially with economy as a key driver. And one of the key focus that has shifted the way that Cambodia itself has positioned Industrial 4.0 is through STEM education. And this is the area of work that I'm currently involved with. Now, as we look at STEM, we tend to look at the hard skills, science, learning, technology, math, and perhaps even in many of schools, how English language learning could be a key driver to melt and to morph this into a program that enables 21st century competencies to become more evident. Clearly, on the planned curriculum, the challenges of looking at that is that the implementation is driven largely from the teacher's dimension. Now, the critical question that I have for everyone to consider is, as we look at values and transversal learning, the beauty, I would say, based on the work that I'm currently looking at in the School of E2 STEM in Phnom Penh, is that among the Khmer culture, a large part of the humanistic dimension of values education is more pervasive in the way of how student-teachers interaction. And what is beautiful in contrast to how we develop 21st century skills learning in several of the Singapore programs. For example, here in Singapore, and Shu Xing, you can talk a bit more about this later on, in applied learning program, in FLP program, and even in our character and citizenship program, is this. They have a more fluid way of allowing inquiry-based learning, not through science, not through technology, not even through design and technology, but through the way self-directed learning happens. Now, that to me is a useful point of insight. From my research using narrative inquiry, looking at the qualitative dimensions of the case studies, what is jumping out to me is that they go back to what's fundamental. They go back to what is core in terms of what is the universal dimension of values learning. And that to me talks about how the culture develops that. But let's just take a second to pause. I'm now looking at Phnom Penh and I'm wondering, how might this be more pervasive in the provinces of Cambodia? Clearly, the government, the MOEYS, has put forward the policies to drive, for example, the new generation schools onto the next level of learning. While technology is being enabled, and technology is being now forecast as one of the key drivers for how curriculum innovation should take the schools forward. But I also see concurrently and parallel how some of these changing dynamics allow people to have a new opinion, a new perspective, and to look at the way curriculum morphs into how students internalize some of these dimensions. The road is still very wide open. Of course, clearly right now with COVID, a lot of schools are still in transition to blended learning. And that leaves us a lot more room to look at this. Clearly, I would say this, with COVID learning, with COVID right now imposing a lot of physical geographies and emotional learning challenges to Cambodia, what is exciting me, I would say, is this. I see how teachers initiate some of this. And this to me is where cultures and values and identity is being shaped and learned. Noting clearly that Cambodia is still pushing itself to the next level of curriculum and educational progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Is there something you would like to add, Shuxing, or should we move, please?
I will just add on very, very quickly to provide, to complement John's perspective from a Singaporean perspective. And I think our audience here may be interested to understand what Singapore policy is and how our enactment is like. So what is the strength of our policy is that, and thank you, Dr. Cheng, for putting such nice words about our policy, but really we have the luxury of being a very small country. And that is to our advantage, where we can find coherence from policy right down to teacher education and partnership with schools. But at the same time, we are trying to do two things, both top down and bottom up. So our schools have really autonomy in the school-based curriculum to make sense. And there is an ecology. And this ecology of enacting school-based curriculum is not just within the school, but also with partners such as communities where we have authentic tasks, and schools and teachers and pupils all come together to play with these authentic tasks and engage in reflection, where our teachers reflect together with our students about the identity forming process, the relationships they form within the school, the community, and the choices and justification for choices that they make for the activity that they are intending to carry out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we're going to move now to a very large context, a very diverse context, certainly in relationship to Singapore. And we are fortunate to have Dr. Farah, who can tell us a little bit about the situation of transversal competencies in Malaysia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and respected panelists and everyone, all the audience. Thank you so much for inviting me. Just to share some thoughts about the Malaysian policy. I'd like to start with giving an overview of what the educational policy is in Malaysia. So I think you may have heard about our, quite famous, the Malaysian Educational Blueprint from 2013 to 2025. It's a very ambitious national education blueprint, and all activities, all assessments, and whatever educational, activities or policies must be based on the national blueprint. Okay, so this national blueprint has been analyzed and received a lot of input from up to 55,000 individuals, those from the administrators, teachers, and many organizations, including parents. So I think that starting from that blueprint, all of our, the way we organize our schools are based on this blueprint. And this blueprint is actually based on our national educational policy in 1988, which stressed the importance of producing well-balanced individuals in physical, intellectual, and spiritual abilities. So I'm so much very interested with the discussion earlier by Professor Cheng and the panelists, where they said about the values education, and I'm also working on that. Anyway, coming back to the overview. So in this national blueprint that Malaysia have, there are 11 pillars of transformation that all school agencies have to follow, and they are very good and very, as I mentioned earlier, ambitious. And one of it is cultivating values-driven Malaysians. And what that means is that Malaysia have identified several values that the students or the children in Malaysia should have. Okay, so this has been enacted, or I can say planned rather than enacted, okay, using what we call 10 cross-curricular components that focuses on several areas, for example, communication, spirituality, humanity, strengths, and so on. So from Malaysia point of view, we have a blueprint, and now it's just a matter of following the blueprint and trying to adjust a little bit. So if I can mention also here is that the national educational policy is much more on something from the top down, okay, and not something so much from the bottom up perspective, even though they have received a lot of input. I think that it is quite normal when we give some input to the authorities and they make it generic enough so that everybody can follow it. But one of the barriers from my own observations is that there is no particular framework or model on how to do it in the classroom. But I think we are trying our best as teachers to practice it and adjust to our own situation in the specific school. I think, get back to you, Aaron.
Thank you so much to tell us a little bit about the development of the Malaysian National Blueprint and how novel and visionary it is, despite the many implementation issues. So I'd like to move to our Vietnamese expert. Nguyen, the floor is yours. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about how transversal competencies are being integrated into the Vietnamese curriculum, or in terms of policies. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm happy to be here to share with you about the Vietnamese policy about transversal skills education. Yeah, overall, the policy is quite perfect in Vietnam. From the education law, we care about the competency, attitude, and citizen awareness for students in schools, in both primary school and secondary school. Yeah, and this follow from the resolution when the government want to move to shift from the provide knowledge to students to develop the competencies and attitude for students. Yeah, and following with that, in the new curriculum, general curriculum in 2018, the curriculum provide the general competencies, includes autonomy and self-studies, communication and collaboration, problem solving, and creativity. Includes with us, we care about some values, such as responsibilities, concerned citizens, about the other, about the country, about the environmental, education, and hardworking, and kindness and honesty. So here, when I think about the rethinking what is the transversal skills, reminder by the Professor Cheng, I think that the transversal skills is not only competencies, skills is more than about the values. So this is the perspective from the curriculum in Vietnam. Yeah. And curriculum create the opportunities to develop the transversal skills, and is followed by the author of the textbook. Yeah. In the textbook, the author pay more attention to improve the transversal skills, like designing the learning activity to based on project learning, problem solving learning, cooperative, or the encouragement of student creativity. Yeah, and I am the author of the one textbook about nature and social for the primary school, and then when I combine the textbook, we also care about it. But the challenges of Vietnam, that is the policy from top to down. So we have some challenges when implementation the competence transversal skills in school. Yeah, when we now we conduct one project in the cooperation with the female Innotech, and when we share with the teacher, they almost lack of the understanding about transversal skills. Yeah, most of them do not understand what the transversal skills or the 21st century skills. They may know something like problem-solving skills, yeah, collaborative skills, but they do not have the overall understanding about the conversal skills, transversal skills. That is the first challenges. And for the second challenge is that is the lack of the material about how to develop the transversal skills for students. So they do not know how. With a lot of students in a class, yeah, how they can conduct the activity for the student can participate in the activity learning. So that is the big challenge. The second challenge is that it how to assess transversal skills. Yeah. They always, how to say, in Vietnam, the second challenge is that is about the focus on knowledge and the test and the assessment. So how can we effort with maybe they care about the score more than the improve the skills. So they care about the knowledge more than the skills. And when they assess the transversal skill, they almost do not know how. They lack of the tool to measure it. And that is the second big challenge is implementation transversal skills in school in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One of the impressions that I have as I listen to colleagues speak about the different evolution of policy in the Southeast Asia region is the willingness of a lot of countries in the region to really rethink the goals and purposes of their education systems. And, you know, I think it is something to stop for just a moment and ask, you know, are we, I mean, Professor Chang kind of made this very clear that the 21st century is also very different from the 20th century. But I think within the education community, there seems to be a kind of a growing appetite to think much more deeply and in somewhat innovative ways. Having spent you know, quite a few years at UNESCO headquarters as the director of the Education Monitoring Report, the reason that I'm here in Seoul, South Korea, is that UNESCO this last week has co-hosted, together with colleagues here in South Korea, something that's known as the 5th Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health and Well-being. And I remarked to you know, one of the senior leaders in the education sector at UNESCO that when I left just a couple of years ago, I would not have imagined that UNESCO would organize an international conference in which the title was Transformative Education. And then I went a little bit further and I looked at, I'm sure, this report that many of you might have seen, which is called kind of a Reimagining the Social Contracts, and especially thinking about the futures of education. And in that document, I think the word transforming or transformative or transformation probably occurs more than 120 or 130 times. And if you go back to some of the other documents, you know, even with the beginning of the SDGs and the Incheon Declaration in 2015, you know, this kind of word transformation was almost missing, or if it did occur, to a much lesser level. So the idea that you can have a conference to speak about a kind of a learning or educational process that is really meant to transform the educational and learning experiences of young and older learners from a much more lifelong perspective is really, kind of illustrative of this period of time that we're living through. And what I hear at least is just a lot of energy and willingness among many of the leaders in the Southeast Asia region to think through these issues, in very innovative ways. And one of the things I think that we've heard is how should we say, the process of developing a major educational reform, especially in the curriculum, has been a little bit more inclusive, in which many different stakeholders and different individuals have been invited to comment on the policies that are envisioned. But what we've also heard, and this will kind of bring us to the second round of questions, is that there are major, although the vision may have moved forward, more expansive, more comprehensive, more holistic, thinking about transversal competencies, which means undermining the usual silos of knowledge within the disciplines, that despite a very innovative and holistic vision, one of the biggest issues is around implementation, the how. So the kind of the where you wish to get to is becoming much clearer. The much more difficult thing is the how. And it's clear that different colleagues have spoken to issues around teacher preparation, to issues around assessment, and many others. But I'd like them, if they could each take a turn, to speak specifically about the implementation challenges. And one of the ways that they can also discuss this is speaking to any kind of research that has been undertaken, even though in many cases it's still quite early because of the process of the curriculum reforms, but the extent to which research has maybe highlighted certain kinds of implementation challenges and issues that are being confronted as they roll out this very expansive and very new way of looking at it. So let me begin again with Dr. Joy from the Philippines, who's, I think, right in the belly of the beast trying to figure out the assessment angle. But I'd be interested to hear your views also on some of the broader implementation challenges that the Philippines is experiencing at this time.
All right. We have 3 policies that support transversal competencies. First is the K-12 Basic Education Program, which is the overarching policy on the implementation of the K-12 curriculum. And then we have 2 assessment policies that support transversal competencies. One is the system assessment policy. As I mentioned earlier, we utilize this to implement internal and external assessments. And in this policy, everything is laid out. What assessment will be administered to the students for each key stage 1, key stage 2, key stage 3, and key stage 4. These key stage encompassing from primary to secondary level. And these policies intend to gather evidence and information to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of the implemented program. This policy also intends to gather baselines for monitoring, benchmarking, and other evidence-based information for possible basis for policy changes or changes in practices. And the third policy is on student learning assessment. So this policy also lists all the assessments that will be administered to students from primary to secondary. And currently we are implementing 2 national assessments that assess 21st century skills. And these are administered to grade 6 students, which is the exit of key stage 2, and grade 10 students, which is the exit of key stage 3 or junior high school. And right now we are assessing 3 21st century skills in the national level, and these are information literacy, problem solving, and critical thinking. Since we implemented these policies, we made sure to inform everyone from the national level to the school level. We conduct annual meetings, conferences with our assessment partners in the field offices, which are sub-national offices, and also the school leaders and the teachers. And when these policies were rolled out, these were discussed to them. But it doesn't end there. We meet challenges in the implementation, and we have discovered that there were some definitional challenges. Some teachers do not know how to translate these skills, 21st century skills, into actual learning experiences in the classroom. And we also noticed, based on research conducted, that there were some systemic and operational challenges. We have discovered that students need strong support, teachers need strong support in implementing these policies. For one, they need training. And they need assessment prototypes or materials to be able to translate these desired 21st century skills into actual learning experiences. And these researches have been conducted in partnership with several stakeholders of the Department of Education in the Philippines, such as the UNICEF, and the Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center, and also the ACER, or Australian Council for Educational Research. And we also have different partners from different assessment centers. And we currently, what we are doing right now is we are implementing a professional development program for teachers to increase their assessment literacy. This was conceptualized in 2019, and then for several years it has been prepared. But this year, 2021, it is now being implemented since October this year. And the training for teachers have 5 modules, and one of the modules target increasing the teachers' knowledge on the assessments, all assessments that are implemented from the national level. And these cover the system assessment policy, classroom-based assessment policy, student learning assessment policy, and the new policy on grading students in this time of the pandemic, because we have come up with reduced competencies for students to be able to learn during this time of the pandemic. So there was also a plan how to assess these reduced competencies in the school level, now that we are moving in a different situation right now. So basically that's what's happening in the Philippines.
I wonder if I could do a brief follow-up, because as you know, many people think that the use of summative assessments can be very problematic for all kinds of reasons, and especially in some of the Southeast Asian cultures, the emphasis placed on, exams, especially, strong performance toward the end of the secondary level, these high stakes examinations. So there's a certain, let's say, preponderance about, summative assessment. And many people, would say that in order to really engage with 21st century skills or transversal competencies, there should be much greater emphasis placed on more formative assessments, assessment for learning rather than of learners. And I wonder if this is a debate that's being picked up in the Philippines, and whether or not maybe the balance between summative and formative assessment needs to be rethought. And, to the extent that teachers need to be given opportunities both to create learning experiences around 21st century skills, they also need to be given, let's say, practice in conducting various kinds of formative assessments that are really directed toward understanding the students under their watch. I wonder if you might just pick this up quickly.
Yeah, national assessments in the Philippines are very high stakes. So teachers, schools put a very high premium on the results of the national tests. So, and the previous national assessments were based on the curriculum. And so what the Department of Education did was to shift the assessment focus. So instead of focusing the assessment on subject proficiency, the Philippines, the Department of Education shifted its focus on assessing 21st century skills. So if these skills will be assessed in the national level, then teachers would put premium on teaching the students 21st century skills. So that's what the Philippines did on strategizing how 21st century skills can penetrate or can be integrated in classroom experiences of the students. And right now, what the Philippines is doing is that we have, since there is some operational challenges that we have encountered this pandemic, since we cannot administer paper-based assessments because of some limitations in administering this test in schools, what the Department of Education encourages is that teachers would maximize the use of formative assessment and not depend on national assessments that are administered by the ministry.
Thank you so much. Let me ask John and Shu Xing if they have some additional insight that they can provide either on the Cambodian context or even the Singaporean context. John, I'll start with you about these. I don't think there's no need to kind of go further about the assessment issue, but other kind of implementation challenges that you could identify within the context. Please, the floor is yours.
In my research on how teachers assess students' understanding of 21st century skills, one of the biggest programmatic gaps that I identify is this. And from what I realized, we often go by teaching of strategies. We often use tech tools as a way to enact the learning of these critical thinking, inventive, innovative, or creative thinking. But the reality is, as we go deeper at looking at implementation processes, the challenges of situating, if it's been taught, has it been caught? And to me, that's where we talk about transfer of learning, because if I'm able to use, for example, a tech tool for Kaggle, for Jamboard, whatever these tools might be, and a lot of schools are using this. You see, the baseline here clearly sets that these tools enable or empowers that form of generative thinking to take place in the classroom via dialogue, via reflection. But as what Joyce shared earlier, the challenges is teachers ourselves haven't gone through that form of learning. And so it's easy to teach. And in fact, I hate to use the term teach down. I give you a step-by-step procedural way of enacting that form of learning. And that's where the situation of curriculum and assessment becomes a big divide. Because the reality is, it may not have enabled that transfer of learning to happen. What I've argued and what I've worked with schools and systems is this. In order to ensure that there is a skill up of learning, assessment of driving that behavior and thinking and those values becomes no longer just a soft skill, but how do you ensure that these skills are stacked up? How do you ensure that you allow the same skill sets and values to be learned across different contexts, across different subject areas? So that if we, for example, we say in creative thinking, the affective skill here is play, is imagination, is the ability for students to make connections across different areas. And that's where my area of research in transdisciplinary is. A lot of schools do project-based learning, problem-based learning, and they are all great. But what's the problem is we enact that as a program, but we are struggling to ensure some of these skills. How do you assess them meaningfully? Is it a one-off assessment? How do you ensure that feedback allows feed forward to take place in the classroom, in the curriculum itself? And that to me enables a lot more imagination, because what I study from Cambodia is this. The Cambodian teachers in E2 STEM schools are very clear that they are not the subject matter experts. But through the STEM inquiry-based learning, they have programmatically designed very useful sessions where students bring forth their questions, and that leads back to if 21st century skills learning requires not just the know-hows, but the metacognition of how do you allow them to meander and to search for more information, to search for more resources and mentors. That's where I think the teachers have come up very strong, because the notion of co-creation and co-learning has become a very frontal part of the STEM curriculum. And that to me is heartening, because I think there's some lessons that we can learn. How does assessment now no longer becomes the bandwagon of shifting learning and pushing it forward, but how does assessment go concurrently, right? And in some of the implementation, I ask schools and groups of schools to look at portfolio assessment using solo taxonomy, so that they can have rubrics and benchmarks, but they no longer just becomes artificial documents to guide teachers. That to me can be very oftentimes a very officious way of implementation. But how do you allow students themselves to do self-directed peer learning and choose criteria that they own it? That's where the internal assessment comes as part of saying not just skills learning, but allowing them to match and create new materials and new content. That's where the power of curriculum innovation truly is, in melting assessment and implementation dilemmas.
I'd like to take on a question from the Q&A, which I think we can tap on to the conversation that I'm going to have with everyone, latching on to some of John's points. So the question in the Q&A, the first question, and unfortunately is not able to pronounce it correctly, so I don't know how to pronounce your name, but so I will remain anonymous then. So it's about curriculum planning by experts will be useless if content is not implemented as intended. So teachers are the most important agents of change. How can the authorities ensure that the teacher's implementation is as intended? Okay, so John is talking about teachers are students of 20th century. And now we want to teach students for a future that we do not even know. And for us as teachers, I think first, in my research I've seen is that teachers need to go through a mindset shift. And this mindset shift involves learning with your students, learning from your students, similarly with your colleagues. And this whole community is when you have diverse experts and you latch on this idea of distributed expertise. Everybody brings a portion of expertise to the plate. Policy does tell you something, the main ideas, but really I question you, do you think policy know the finer details of what's happening that's relevant to students, relevant to your profile of students, relevant to what you are comfortable as a teacher to teach? And so, for the enactment of policy, I think that one, yes, we need to meet big benchmarks. We need to meet big ideas. But as a community of teachers within the school, you need to tap on this community to learn together and leverage on your expertise and play. Like what John said, failing is learning. It's about playing, failing forward. And if you have good practices, you should showcase. And this is where everybody can begin to play and make sense. What is transversal? What is this dinosaur? Or we are dinosaurs. Okay, so the whole idea is about shifting mindsets of professional learning, one, considering, yes, you need to balance two things, policy and practice, but where is the fine line? Leverage on your community, leverage on your students to give you feedback on what is most relevant and important to them.
Thank you so much. Before I turn it over to our colleague from Malaysia, I just wish to intervene briefly that I think there's one other element that hasn't really come up so far in the conversation, and that's the role of textbooks and other kinds of fundamental educational materials. And my colleagues at NISM and I, have come to the conclusion that, in many contexts, and not just in the global South, but especially in the global South, there is often a reliance to organize what goes on in the classroom around what is kind of embedded in the textbook. And to the extent that the country wishes to move toward a different kind of pedagogy in the classroom, if the textbooks remain kind of in the ways in which they have been traditionally organized around bodies of knowledge and kind of learning facts and very cognitively oriented, you can't really get too far. And it's clear that many of the people that are writing textbooks have never really been prepared or trained to include, let's say, transversal skill practice pedagogy into the textbooks, or in our case, also social emotional learning. So there's another challenge here that I think also we don't, I would venture to say that even as different countries in the region move toward an emphasis on transversal competencies, they're not getting rid of textbooks. And so then the question becomes, how do you make use of textbooks that may not be up to date, or that how should we say, address the challenge of this altered approach that you're taking here. Let me ask Farah to comment at this point in terms of these challenges and from the Malaysian perspective.
Thank you, Aaron. I totally agree with all the panelists, especially about the assessment, the needs for us to change how we see it and how it can and should drive the teaching and learning activities. I think that from my point of view, when talking about transversal or 21st century skills, a lot of literature or research talk about the mechanistic aspect of the skills. Okay, we talk a lot about what needs to be learned, what needs to be taught, okay, and what needs to be built, what skills needed for the students. But I think that we have a little bit forgotten the attitudinal aspect of the children that we need to develop, the empathy, respectfulness, and so on. This is something that I see very rarely discussed in the literature talking about 21st century skills, but I can find it in the values and moral education literature. Okay, and I think that these two components, or these two literatures, body of knowledge, needs to be talking to each other. Anyway, secondly is that I think there is too much burden given to the teachers as the curriculum implementers. Okay, I had experience working as giving input to the ministry about curriculum and so on, and I felt a little bit guilty because we asked a lot from the teachers. Teachers should be able to teach this, to do that, and in our textbook we have make it very, very interactive, where students can now just go through certain website and then learn by themselves. So because we wanted for them to self-explore, but we also forgot that there are basic things that our students and teachers do not have. Okay, for example, the time slot given for a teacher to teach these skills in a classroom is just limited to 30 to 40 minutes per day. How do you expect it can be done? Okay, so it has to be supplemented by co-curricular activities and so on. But then teachers are very busy, okay, doing a lot of administrative works. Okay, I'm not so sure what happened in your countries, but in Malaysia, teachers are also taking care of the co-curricular activities, doing a lot of intervention programs and so on, and they don't have time actually for themselves. Okay, so I think this can be improved. Okay, another thing is that there's a large number of students per class. Okay, in typical classroom public school in Malaysia, it's about 30 to 40 students. Okay, how do you expect a teacher to interact with the students within 30 minutes time of view? So this is something that we need to really think about. But I can be. This is not so good for me to say, but I think that COVID-19 has also given us a chance to relook at our system, where in Malaysia now, children are come to school, taking part, going to school. So there will be two groups Okay, if there is 40 students in the classroom, 20 will go this week, another 20 the next week. So this is very good, okay, in terms of teachers can pay more attention to the 20 people who come to the school that day. Okay, I think that's something we need to think. And the third observation, I think, is that our way of measuring students' development also need not to be too mechanistic. Okay, I've mentioned about the policy, the educational print. Every year there are assessments to be done. Okay, teachers have to input what marks they give to the students, you know, and this kind of assessment. There's a lot of assessment, by the way. So they have been inputting a lot of numbers, but it's just numbers. Okay, what about if we can change the way we ask questions? Maybe we can ask teacher, what do you think of the development of this particular student, Farah, from the January until December? So it's something that we need to teach teacher, and maybe us, maybe myself as one of the curriculum developer and designer, I also need to take more point on that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm sure I don't have an exhaustive list of some of the challenges that have been raised so far, but the list that I have in front of me includes the following. We've heard about overburdened teachers, sometimes unprepared teachers. We've heard about outdated and outmoded textbooks. We've heard about inappropriate or incomplete assessments. We've heard about the challenges of teaching to large classes. And often, although nobody has spoken about it, people often refer to an overloaded curriculum, that teachers are being asked to cover a lot of material and there is never enough time. I wonder if I'm turning to our Vietnamese colleague, she would like to either confirm or even indicate other particular challenges that have emerged from the Vietnamese context.
Yeah, thank you. I want to share more challenges in Vietnamese. Yeah, that is the big gap from the policy to the practice. Yeah. When I asked some teachers about what is transversal skills, a lot of them say that, oh, what is it? This is the first time I have heard about it. So how they can implement it when they almost do not understand what it is. So this is a big gap from the opinion of the educator who proposed the policy and the teacher who will implement the policy. So how to fill the gap between the policy and the practice, that we need to train teachers about this. Yeah, give them the understanding about the transversal skills, give them the material, guiding them how to teach transversal skills in school, and give them the tools for assessment. So that is, that include with the assessment from Philippines, from Malaysia. So I want to include one more big challenges in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we might open it up now. We have just a few minutes left, or maybe 10 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. I think that we've covered some of the questions that have mentioned in the Q&A. I wonder if any of the other colleagues among the presenters and moderators wish to intervene at this point and maybe either ask a question or make a quick comment based on what we've heard from the different country contexts.
Can I just make a quick point?
Yes, please do.
It is easy from a policy standpoint, as well as from a school leaders or curriculum designer standpoint, to structure curriculums in silos. So if I look at subject matter learning, the reality is a lot of them embodies disciplinary thinking as well. Now, that same set of skills, disciplinary thinking, requires us not to just understand the heuristics, the algorithm, this content, but a lot of these have that dimension of how does a child respond to them? And that's why I keep highlighting that we need to examine the perspective of the experienced curriculum. how much of that is lost from the planned, the enacted, and the experienced curriculum? Because if you always examine curriculum from a policy top-down standpoint, a lot of it is lost and filtered away. But reality is when we look at how some of these level up, the baselines offers new insights to saying, hey, technology has served this purpose of allowing a child to be critical in examining this piece of resource, textbook, case studies. But at the same time, a lot of it creates more than just dialogue, but allows teachers to say, what are those parts that we aren't examining? Assessment allows us to then open the scope to say, hey, how might this help us to set a better stage for that learning to become real? 21st century skills aren't just a set of dispositions or transversal skills. They are values, and values built over time. And that goes back to the earlier question. How do you teach, and is it being caught? And that's why the argument is curriculum becomes the key driver for learning. Then what should happen is teachers as gatekeepers should be empowered, but not overburdened to do those assessment, the administrative part. Because a lot of what I'm learning from Cambodia is, while they are going on this trajectory, they are creating more space for some of these to take place. And that to me is the beauty of how transversal learning becomes extremely real in the experience curriculum.
Thank you very much, John. Your image seems to have frozen, but we heard very clearly what you had to say. So that's very good. Is there anyone else who would like to intervene with a brief comment or question at this point? One of the experiences that I personally had when I had the opportunity of spending time in Japan some years ago, and I believe this is a slightly different way of understanding some of the obstacles. One of the impressions that I have is that as we speak among experts in the area, scholars, researchers, policymakers, there's, let's say, a lingua franca that exists that allows us to kind of interact and exchange ideas, often based in English, often based on concepts that have been legitimated through English, not only, but predominantly so. Whereas, as you move closer to the classroom and to schools, to, school leaders and to teachers, there may be a very different kind of language that may be at variance with understandings of the lingua franca. And the experience that I've conveyed from time to time with my colleagues is that, I had the occasion when I was a visiting scholar at Hiroshima University to go to one of their schools that are used. In other words, the Ministry of Education in Japan had analyzed very carefully the results of the PISA assessment at some point and realized that one of the key areas that Japanese students were very poor in was the area of critical thinking. So they then tasked, each of the provincial prefecture kind of model schools to have teachers figure out how do you incorporate critical thinking in subjects like science or mathematics and areas that don't necessarily lend themselves, at least at first. And so, they took this task to heart and figured out innovative ways to, let's say, integrate critical thinking in the teaching of 8th grade mathematics. And so, as typical in Japan, they invite all the teachers from the prefecture to come to the model schools and to have a demonstration about how they might incorporate a new lesson plan and a new pedagogical practice, based on this kind of innovation. And at the end, they get together and they have a conversation about what they've seen and what they observed. And I was sitting there, I don't speak Japanese, unfortunately, but I was sitting there listening and I had somebody translating in my ear. And so she was explaining to me, kind of in the translation is the model teacher and also the prefecture inspector were talking that whenever they came to the word critical thinking, they didn't use it in Japanese, they used it in English. because the word, so I turned to my interpreter and I said, is there no word in Japanese for critical thinking? And she said, Aron sensei, of course there is, but it has many negative connotations. And so I said to her, maybe that's the reason that it's so difficult to teach critical thinking in Japan, because, you know, there's this kind of very different, I'm not sure I'd call it mindset, but a very different kind of language to speak about these issues that carries with it many different connotations. So I wonder if there's not something, a lesson for us to be learned here in terms of transversal skills and some of the things that make sense to an international community of researchers and scholars and policymakers, because we are kind of involved in this kind of policy discourse. But as we move toward, you know, local implementation and bringing this into local schools and to speak to teachers, you know, that part of it is that there's a gap in how we talk about it, you know, how we speak about these issues. Anyway, some food for thought. We have maybe just 5 minutes before we need to bring this to an end. If there's some last minute insights that I would ask each of the panelists, they can have a minute to any concluding point that they would like to make. Joy, I could start with you.
Okay, it's very important there is alignment between policy and practice. In the Philippines, we have just completed, our assessment partner has just completed the research. The Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center did this study for the Philippines Department of Education. So this research focused on understanding what is the intended curriculum, the assessed curriculum, and the implemented curriculum. So there should be alignment between what is planned to what is implemented. This is as important as there should be alignment between the curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy, and also the learning resources and services, and this includes the textbooks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe Shuxing, do you have a final point you would like to make?
What I would like to say is that we always talk about teachers as agents of change, but always in my work when I go to schools, teachers always feel so small about themselves.
Mm.
What I think it's, we as teachers, you need to begin to gather evidences of the work that you do. Teachers do, they just do and do and do, and they need to pause as a community to reflect. And reflect on what? Reflect on artifacts of their work, reflect on students' work, students' voices. And that's when you collate, you can have a louder voice. And you can bring to your school leader, you can bring to a policymaker to say, this is what I've done, and this, I think this works because. And then maybe as teachers, we become more insightful in the way that we work, and also our voices gets louder and policymakers hear us better. I would like to end with this encouraging note to our educators.
Thank you so much. Farah, do you have a brief concluding comment?
Yes, just actually not a comment, but an additional point. Regarding the teachers' professional development, I think it is very important, but I just wanted to suggest perhaps we change the way we train our teachers, not just imparting all the knowledge and skills that we wanted them to be able to do, but what about we teach them the purpose of the profession, okay, the purpose of the teaching profession. Okay, so if we can grow back or make them be reminded of what is the true and noble purpose of being a teacher, I think they will be, you know, they don't really mind doing a lot of work because they really love the profession. They wanted to educate people to be human and so on. And I would like to just mention this word. I saw there's some literature about how Japanese teachers are also being introduced to the word ikigai, if I pronounce it properly, okay, which is a sense of purpose. Or in the United States, they say civic-minded profession, okay, and which is also my research rely on. So maybe we can teach teachers not to be agent of change, but to be civic-minded professionals in their area. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much. Lovely idea. Yeah, again, do you have any parting comment? Because I know we need to bring this to a close, session 2. Maybe I'd mispronounce your name.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so for the brief, I want to raise a question. What is the real goal of the transversal skill education? Yeah, what is for teacher to be teacher to teach student, or what is for the real life of the student in the future? Yeah, so when we think, when the teacher and the educator thinks about this, so they will have find the right way, right approach to teach them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So with that, I'd like to bring this session 2 to a close, and I would like to genuinely thank each of the presenters for a very engaging, well, each of the panelists for a very engaging session with lots of food for thought. And I'd like to thank also the audience for their contributions and the questions. And at this point, I'll turn it back to the MC in headquarters at Hanoi.
Thank you, Professor.